The roar of the crowd shakes the very foundation of the Reichstag building in Berlin. This moment, seemingly just another speech, would change the course of history forever. On March 23, 1933, Adolf Hitler, speaking before a crowded chamber, seized control of a nation on the brink of collapse. As we stand at this crossroads in history, the clock ticks relentlessly. At the heart of this dramatic change lies one man, armed not with an army, but with words. In the early 1930s, Germany was desperate. The country was reeling from the aftermath of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and the Great Depression. Millions were unemployed, and the Weimar Republic, fragile and weak, seemed powerless to stop the economic collapse. The people were desperate for change. Any change. Enter Adolf Hitler, an unknown radical with a blistering message of national pride and vengeance. He rose from the ashes of Germany's humiliation, offering a vision of strength, unity, and vengeance. His charisma, his ability to stir emotions, made him a voice of hope in a nation drowning in despair. But there was something darker lurking behind those promises, something insidious that would slowly unravel the very fabric of democracy. The Reichstag fire, just days before Hitler's speech, was the spark that lit the fire of authoritarian rule. It was the perfect storm. The fire, blamed on communist agitators, allowed Hitler to frame his speech as one of national security. But this was no ordinary plea for help. Hitler's words were crafted to exploit fear, to convince the German people that only his leadership could save them from an impending collapse. It was a speech that would manipulate fear and convert it into action. In the Reichstag on that fateful day, Hitler's words were sharp, cold, and calculated. He spoke of enemies, both foreign and domestic, and the need for absolute unity. His rhetoric, though wrapped in the language of patriotism, was a poison. It promised strength but delivered division. It offered safety but sowed chaos. Hitler's appeal to the German people was simple. Order would be restored, but only if they trusted him with absolute power. The speeches that followed this day would be just as dangerous, laying the groundwork for the dismantling of German democracy. But the rhetoric was working. In the months that followed, the country would transform. Every institution, every safeguard, was methodically dismantled under the guise of necessity. What followed was not a revolution in the traditional sense, but a slow, systematic erosion of democratic principles. Behind the scenes, Hitler was securing the very tools of dictatorship. The Reichstag fire decree, passed shortly after the speech, suspended civil liberties and allowed the government to arrest political opponents without trial. The German people, terrified by the specter of communism and disorder, gave their consent. They were swept up in the wave of fear and false promises of stability. Hitler knew exactly what he was doing. He played them like a maestro with an orchestra, building tension before the final strike. With the passage of the Enabling Act, Hitler's path to absolute power was clear. It wasn't a coup, it wasn't violence, but a carefully orchestrated legal takeover. The Reichstag, once the proud symbol of German democracy, was now a puppet theater. The votes were bought, the opposition silenced, and the Nazi Party was solidified as the true power in Germany. Hitler was no longer just chancellor, he was the Führer, the undisputed leader of the Third Reich. As the months wore on, the effects of Hitler's speech became visible across Germany. The press was censored, political opponents were either imprisoned or executed, and the once vibrant democratic institutions crumbled under the weight of dictatorship. But there was more to come. The Reichstag speech was just the beginning. The Nazi Party's next steps would be even more dangerous. The world, however, was unaware of the full extent of Hitler's plans. He had already laid the foundation for what would later become World War II. But for now, the German people, disillusioned and hopeful for a future free from the shadows of the past, were willing to follow him. They had given him their trust, and that trust would soon be their undoing. This moment was only the beginning. The consequences of this speech would echo across decades, reshaping not only Germany but the entire world. Hitler's rise was not inevitable. It was a calculated, strategic maneuver that capitalized on fear, anger, and despair. But what would come next? As Hitler's rise continued, Germany's transformation into a dictatorship became increasingly evident. The Reichstag speech marked the beginning of a new era, one where political opponents were systematically eliminated and the machinery of totalitarianism started turning with terrifying efficiency. The Enabling Act, passed shortly after that pivotal speech, gave Hitler the legal authority to bypass the Reichstag and rule by decree. This was not just a matter of political maneuvering, it was the beginning of a regime that would rewrite history. The Nazis had a clear vision of the future, a vision that would shape every facet of German society. The state, under Hitler's leadership, began to infiltrate every aspect of life. The control over the press, education, and the arts were the first steps in this transformation. The government silenced opposition, seized control of the media, and began to spread its ideology far and wide. Every newspaper, every broadcast, every film was crafted to promote the Nazi agenda, to glorify the regime and vilify its enemies. Hitler's speeches were no longer limited to the Reichstag. They became a tool of mass mobilization. Through radio broadcasts, the Nazi Party was able to reach millions, presenting Hitler not as a mere politician, but as the embodiment of the nation's destiny. The use of propaganda was ingenious. Hitler's speeches became the lifeblood of the regime. They were designed to inspire loyalty, to create a sense of unity, and most importantly, to incite hatred against those labeled as enemies of the state. But while propaganda helped solidify Hitler's grip on power, it was the violence that truly kept the regime in place. The SA Sturmabteilung, also known as the Brown Shirts, played a crucial role in the early days of Nazi rule. Their job was to intimidate, assault, and silence any opposition. Political enemies, socialists, communists, and Jews were targeted, beaten, and often killed in broad daylight. These acts of terror became routine, and the government, under Hitler's orders, turned a blind eye to the brutality. The SS, initially a small group of personal bodyguards for Hitler, grew rapidly in influence and power. Under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, the SS became the main instrument of Nazi terror. The SS was responsible for overseeing the concentration camps, where millions of Jews and other minorities would eventually be murdered. What began as a police force to protect the regime soon became the brutal enforcer of its genocidal policies. Germany's political system had been fundamentally altered by 1933. The Reichstag, once the heart of German democracy, was now a rubber stamp for Hitler's decrees. The political opposition was decimated. Socialists, communists, and anyone who posed a threat to Nazi ideology was silenced. The last remnants of democratic institutions were dismantled, and the Nazi Party stood unchallenged. While the political sphere was being taken over, the Nazi regime's grip on culture was just as oppressive. The arts were put under strict state control. Artists, writers, and filmmakers were required to adhere to the ideals of the Nazi Party, and those who did not were censored or persecuted. The regime's focus on racial purity extended to culture as well, with Nazi-approved art, literature, and music dominating the public sphere. Anything that deviated from the party line was deemed degenerate and discarded. One of the most shocking aspects of Hitler's rise to power was the speed with which the country transitioned from a fragile democracy to a totalitarian state. Within months, the Nazis had transformed Germany into a militarized society. The Wehrmacht, Germany's military, was reformed to reflect Nazi values. The military was no longer a neutral institution, separate from politics. It became an extension of the Nazi Party. The influence of the military grew, and soon they were complicit in the regime's aggressive policies. The rearmament of Germany was one of the earliest signs that Hitler's ambitions were not confined to the borders of his own country. In violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler began rebuilding Germany's military. Tanks, airplanes, and warships were produced in secret factories. The world, still recovering from the devastation of World War I, failed to notice the growing threat on the horizon. Hitler's speeches were filled with promises of restoring Germany to its former glory, but they also hinted at his larger, more dangerous plans. The Nazi regime's foreign policy was just as radical. Hitler, once in power, began to tear apart the fragile peace in Europe. The first step was the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. The world watched as German troops marched into the region, violating the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations, weakened and divided, did nothing. Hitler's success only emboldened him, and he began to set his sights on other territories in Europe. His aggressive expansionism would soon lead to the outbreak of World War II. But before war could begin, Hitler had to deal with his domestic enemies. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934 was one of the most brutal purges in Nazi history. The SA, which had helped Hitler rise to power, was now seen as a threat to the regime's stability. Hitler, determined to consolidate his power, ordered the mass execution of SA leaders and other political opponents. It was a bloody night that sent a clear message to anyone who dared oppose him. The price of resistance was death. The terror was not confined to political opponents. The Jews, already marginalized by the Nazi regime, were now systematically targeted. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were passed, stripping Jews of their citizenship and restricting their rights. These laws laid the foundation for the Holocaust, which would later claim the lives of millions. The persecution of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, and others deemed undesirable became the core of Nazi ideology. But Hitler's vision of racial purity was not limited to Germany. The Nazis began to spread their ideology across Europe, encouraging other countries to adopt similar policies. Collaborationist regimes were established in countries like Hungary, Romania, and Italy. These regimes, in turn, participated in the persecution of Jews and other minorities, often with the full support of the Nazi regime. The war that Hitler had long desired was now inevitable. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 was the final spark that ignited the flames of World War II. In that moment, Hitler's ambitions for dominance over Europe became a global conflict. The world, once complacent in its belief that the horrors of war were behind them, now found itself in the midst of a new, even more devastating conflict. But the question remains, how did it all happen? How did a man like Hitler, with his dangerous rhetoric and twisted vision, rise to such power? The answer lies in the manipulation of fear, the exploitation of weakness, and the use of propaganda. Hitler's rise was not a fluke. It was the result of years of careful planning, strategic alliances, and the ability to exploit the fears and frustrations of a nation at its breaking point. The global consequences of Hitler's rise were staggering. The destruction caused by World War II was unparalleled in human history. Tens of millions of lives were lost, entire cities were obliterated, and the course of history was irreversibly altered. The legacy of Hitler's regime continues to haunt the world to this day, reminding us of the dangers of unchecked power and the terrifying consequences of silence in the face of tyranny. In the years that followed, the world would grapple with the aftermath of Hitler's rise. The Nuremberg trials would bring some of the regime's top officials to justice, but the scars left by the war were deep and lasting. The Holocaust, a horror that still echoes through the generations, served as a stark reminder of the horrors that can result from unchecked power and the dehumanization of entire groups of people. The lessons of Hitler's rise are clear. We must remain vigilant, never allowing fear or hatred to dictate our actions. The rise of totalitarian regimes begins with the erosion of democracy and the silence of the people. We must never forget that history, once lost, is often irretrievable. The cost of complacency is too great. The legacy of Hitler's rise to power serves as a chilling warning for future generations.